Hello, 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 hello. Yeah, this is International Master Oladapo Adu again. And I actually showed us a video recently, which was one of the games that I played at one of the past Olympiads. And I think this was the Olympiad that that was hosted by the city Elista, Kalmykia Republic. This was in 1998. Yeah. So, it was a game that I played where, I sacked a queen and it had so much play and eventually won the game. So after that game, it got me thinking, I wonder how, the players before me, I wonder how they did, in their own encounters. So I started digging. So I came up with some games, but of course I can't go through all those games in this sitting. But I came up with one of the games that one of our great players played. His name is Mr. Taju Oyeneyin. He's he's always been a chess fighter. So this is a game he played at the Thessaloniki Olympiad. This was in 1988, and I think it was around 13. He was playing against I think Masango Mark from Zimbabwe. The interesting thing about this game was it was a Khan, Sicilian Khan. So it was the Sicilian defense, the Khan variation. So, I looked at the game and it was really interesting the way he was able to handle that position. Even this was even way back in 1988. So I figured, I went through the game, it was interesting. And I said, you know what, let me do a video about this game, you know, share my comment as regards to what the opening is in this current age compared to what it used to be. Because one thing about theory is theory changes a lot. Theory is always changing. So this was, like I said, it's a game played by Mr. Oyeneyin Taju at the Thessaloniki Olympiad. And I think he ended up with 6.5 out of 11 points at that tournament. I remember that. It was on board four. I remember Mr. Oris, late Oris Sharaibi was on board one. Former President Theophilus Caiaphas was on board two. Another former president, Mr. Emmanuel Omuku, aka Mani, was on board three. Mr. Oyeneyin was on board four, and Mr. Ishere Sampson was on board five. So let's get right into this game. Like I said, it's the Sicilian Khan. Very interesting game. So the game started with the move e4, black plays c5. Of course, that move signifies, I'm not looking to play any kind of quiet opening with the move e5 or play some kind of Harukan or French. I'm playing the Sicilian defense, which is an aggressive defense. It's a fighting defense. If you're not a fighter, shouldn't be looking to play the Sicilian defense. So after the move c5, knight f3 was played, e6. E6 is a very flexible move when it comes to the Sicilian. If you play the move d6, you're pretty much trying to get into the Nashdorf or the dragon. For d6, you have a little bit of transposition. E6 is actually in the line of the pulsing variation, where you can either have the Khan or the Taimano. So after the move e6, white plays d4. Of course, the point of d4 is to fight for the square that black is actually eyeing. If you notice in this position, with the move d4, white is trying to get off the hold of the pawn on c5. So c takes d4, knight takes d4, a6. Now we are in the Sicilian Khan. And these are the moves. This pawn structure is really what signifies what makes it the Sicilian Khan. So let's see how the game continued. C4. Recently I started playing the Khan myself. And, just to let you know, whatever you're doing now, it's pretty much been done before at some point. So it's pretty much, someone has done it before at some point, and whatever we are doing now is something that has been refined. So now the c4 variation is played against the Khan. The c4 variation is actually what we know as the Maroczy bind. And what's the idea of the Maroczy bind? White is pretty much trying to stop black from either playing d5 or b5. So that's why you have the pawn on c4, keeping an eye on b5, d5, and the one on e4, keeping an eye on d5 and f5. So with the pawn on c4, we are in the Maroczy bind variation. And one of the most played lines against the Maroczy bind in those years was the edge of, which is what was employed in this game by Mr. Taju. So after the move c4, knight f6, bishop d3. Now I have to point this out. Knight f6 is actually the most played move here. Now e5 does not force this knight back because there's a queen a5 check picks the pawn. We shall remember that. So after the move, knight f6, bishop d3. Normally in this position, white normally moves the knight to c3. That's the mostly played move in this position, knight to c3. But white decides to just get the bishop to d3. After bishop to d3, bishop to e7. Note we still can't push this pawn because of the queen check and picks the pawn on e5. So bishop to e7, castles. Now e5 is a threat. e5 forces the knight back to a bad square, and then all of a sudden white is looking really good. Now d6. In one of the earlier videos I did, d6 is not such a cool move in the Khan. I don't know why I'm giving out all these secrets, but you know what? If it's out there, it's really not a big deal. d6 is not always the best nowadays line to play on the black side of the Khan. Because what it does, like in my earlier videos, it restricts the activity of your bishop on e7. So your bishop really on e7 is doing more of a defensive role than an attacking role if the d6 was delayed. So what would be a good move for black in this position? There's queen to c7. And after queen to c7, the idea is to move the pawn to b6, bishop to b7, and maybe knight to c6. And at some point, bring this bishop to d6 to harass the pawn on h2. Probably trying to force the advance of f4, which now you can relocate your bishop to the c5 square, putting a lot of pressure on that diagonal. All right? Well, like I said, this is 1988, so let's see how the Khan was played then. So in this position, d6 was played, knight to c3, developing the piece to c3, the most natural square, keeping an eye on the central squares. Knight b d7. Like I said, the setup black adopted here is pretty much the setup we know as the hedgehog. When you talk about the hedgehog, it's the situation whereby all your pieces are all on the first three ranks on your own part of the board. So if you notice, there is none of black's pieces on the fourth rank all the way. Everything goes on the third rank and below. So after the move knight b d7, b3. I think b3 is a little slow normally in this position. b3 is not what you really want to do. In this position, a better move would be to move the bishop to e3. It's very important you move the bishop to e3 as quick as possible to vacate the c1 square, which puts a lot of pressure on the c file, which is also a very good square for the rook. So b3 was played here. After b3, black castles, bishop to b2. Like I said, not the best diagonal for the bishop. Not a bad move, but not the best move. And this is the reason is when you're playing chess, you always want to maximize your pieces. You don't want to just develop for developing sake. You want to develop with an idea of putting a lot of pressure on your opponent. So after the move bishop to b2, queen to c7, this is the most natural square for the black queen in most of the Sicilian games. Now, what's the idea of the queen c7? It does a lot of things. Number one, it keeps an eye on the e5 square. It also keeps an eye on the c file. It also defends the bishop that is about to get to b7. Because anytime the bishop gets to b7, even though it has the long range look here, it is a weak piece unless there's something defending it. So the queen c7 is one of the reasons why the queens go to c7 is to defend the bishop on b7. So queen c7 and king to h1. King h1 is it's a prophylactic move in most Sicilian on the white side. And the idea is to get the king away from the, I would say, the a7 g1 diagonal. Because at some point in time, white has to play f4. And the idea of f4 is to play either e5 or f5. You know, in the Sicilian, white is just looking to attack black's king. And that's why black always tries to look for some counterplay on the queen side to try to slow down white's attack on the king side, and in the same vein, try to create some play for himself on the queen side. So after the move king h1, b6 was played. Like I said, you have to maximize your pieces, put them on the best squares possible. After the move b6, f4 was played. We don't really have to worry about e5 right now because we have enough pieces keeping an eye on that e5 square. So after the move f4, bishop to b7. Now I think this is a premature move for white. It's a premature move. Now let's think about it. Black has developed all its pieces. All the pieces are looking pretty good. Bishop on b7, knight on f6, knight on d7, bishop on e7. Okay? And of course, he has also moved the screen to the most natural square and connected his rooks. So black is pretty much waiting to create some play here. All right? And meanwhile, white, even though has developed all his minor pieces, I think it's very important for white to get the queen off the back rank to connect the rooks. Not just connect the rooks, but also centralize the rooks. Moving the pawn right away to f5 without actually maximizing the placement of your pieces, like the rooks, is not such a good idea for white. So personally, I don't like the move f5. So if I had this position, what would I have played? I probably would have moved my queen to e2. There's queen to e2, connecting my rooks, or there's queen to e1 with the idea of queen to h4, all right? And then we always have this rook f3, rook h3 switch, putting pressure here. And also, we have to also remember that any time the pawn gets to e5, it opens up for the bishop that puts pressure on h7. So all these things, black has to have this in mind and think, very well about what to do about it. Now, one of the reasons I really don't like the move played in this game is, now by moving your pawn to f5, even though you have pressure on the e6, you really can't do anything with the bishop on d3. And in so doing, you're giving up the e5 square. On the white side, you have to be very careful not to give up this e5 square for black. Because if you can land a piece there, it can really slow down a lot of your attacks. So after the move f5, e5 was played. Now, let us see the benefits of that move. What move am I talking about? The move f5. Now, has this move really helped white or worked against white? Think about it. After the move f5, so f5, e5 was played, the bishop on b3 don't look good at all. We might as well replace this bishop with a big pawn. Okay? Bishop on d3 don't look good. The e5 and d6 is a pretty solid setup, which puts this bishop out of the game. So right now the position is pretty much closed. So white's pieces that can actually do anything for white are the knights. So the knight has to look for ways to create some play. Meanwhile, it's not so easy for white to create any play. Remember this, you can't even play g4 now because there's the knight c5 putting pressure on e4. And of course, once the pawn on e4 drops, the king is exposed. So white is not really ready for the for the f5 pawn push. So this is another thing that tells us in a game of chess, before you try to create any kind of attack, you have to be in the position to make that attack work. That means you must have maximized the placement of your pieces. So let's keep going. After the move e5, knight d e2 was played. Knight c5. Immediately, black puts pressure on the e pawn. The e pawn is defended by the bishop on d3. The knight on c3 is attacked by the knight on c5, knight on f6, bishop on b7. So already black has a plan. What's the plan? Put pressure on the e pawn and try to capture it if possible. So here, knight g3 has to be played to defend the pawn. Now let's think about it. The pawn on f5 and the pawn on e4. And there are really no attacks coming on this part of the board for white. I don't think there's any attack coming in the center as well. And for it to actually create an attack, you have to try to play g4, g5. You don't really have that resource because you have your knight on g3. So the question right now is, where exactly is white going to create its play? Not so sure about that. But what about black? Black can always try to create something on the queen side. Probably rook 8 to c8, queen b8. You can even sacrifice this pawn at some point because after takes, if the bishop takes, we can always take back on e4. If the knight takes, we can always still take back on e4. Because the bishop on d3 and the knight on c3 actually defends the b5 square as well. But let us see how the great Oyeneyin, aka Babate Tonji, let's see how he handled this position. So at this point, he played, let's see, yes, knight g3 was played. He plays h5. That's a very interesting move. That's a very interesting move. And I think it's a very bold move, but it's a very flawed move. Why is it a flawed move? You never want to move a pawn on a position where you really could be attacked. You know, it's a risky move, and I'm not so surprised because, like I said, Mr. Taju is a very, he likes to attack. Even though he's sound positionally, but he likes to attack. But the thing is, let's think about it. Who's going to benefit more from the H pawn being off the board? We have to realize that if we have an open H file, the queen, the rook can easily switch here, and there's going to be very hard to stop the mate. And one thing why we have to be really careful with this H pawn is we don't really want to give up the knight on F6. Not that we're giving it up, we're exchanging off the knight. That knight is a very important piece to the black king because it defends some very critical squares on that part of the board. So H5 is a move I would really frown at. I wouldn't play H5 here. If I'm trying to trade pawns for pawns, I prefer to trade my B pawn for the E pawn so that my bishop comes to life. And then, of course, I can have play on either the B file or the C file. So after the move H5, but in this position, in this game, Mr. Oyeneyin was able to make it work. After the move H5, knight D5. Now, that's a very bad move. I have no idea why that move was made. Probably to block the attack on the E4 and try to capture the pawn on H5 and just try to create some complication for black. Like I said, I'm not so sure about that move. What would have been a good move for black in this position? Probably bishop c2 was suggested. Um, bishop c2. But then after the move h4, I can always move my knight to h6, to h5. The knight can always come to h5, exchange of this knight. And if knight takes, queen takes, black has to be very careful here because now this pawn is coming. And you can easily sack this pawn. Pawn push, if bishop takes, rook takes. If pawn takes, you could even bring your rook to c1, to f1. You have to notice that in this position, we have the bishop and the knight being the sole defender of the king on g8. So if we don't have these two pieces on this part of the board, black's king is going to be doomed. And remember what I said in one of my recent videos, rooks are very bad protectors of the king. But anyway, let's get back into the game. So knight d5 was played, which immediately gives black the advantage. Bishop takes d5, good move. Now we have a number of captures here. There's the knight takes, there's the bishop takes. Even let's assume the pawn on h5 is under attack. In this situation, you really have to take with the bishop because taking with the knight makes no sense. If you take with the knight, if the pawn takes here or pawn takes there, the bishop on b7 is just dead. So it makes a lot of sense to capture the bishop. Bishop captures, e takes d5, h4. Now white is in trouble. Now, like I said, Mr. Oye is a very active player. So now h4 is played. Pretty much black has to move the knight, white has to move the knight backwards, which is not a good thing because when the knight goes back, e4 is possible and all of a sudden black's position comes to light. So after the move h4, knight e2 was played, knight to g5. I'm not so sure about that move. Knight to g4. I mean, this is a threat, but I mean, it's not something I think white should really be so worried about because white could just move the queen to d2 and then nothing is happening here. I think knight g4 is just a bad move. It doesn't really do anything. So what else could black have done? There's b5, there's knight takes d3, what else? Yeah, b5, knight takes d3 are possible moves. So after the move knight to g4, like I said, one thing about chess is as long as you can make the line work, we have to be careful who you're playing these lines against. Knight g4 was played. Queen to d2. Queen to d8. What's the point of queen to d8? The idea is to get the bishop to g5 and put pressure on the queen. And of course, get over the, take control over the e3 square, which is a very critical square in this position. So knight c3 was played, bishop to g5. Let's take a quick check on this position. Bishop on b2 is out of the game. Bishop on d3, well, in and out. Knight on c3, yeah, he has some possibilities. If you compare the minor pieces to black's minor pieces, black actually looks a little aggressive, a little well placed. So after the move, queen knight to c3 and queen e2, putting pressure on the knight on g4. Knight takes d3. Now, if you capture on g4, you lose the bishop on b2. So he has to do queen takes d3. After queen takes d3, bishop to f4, putting pressure on the weak pawn on h2. So black has made a lot of strides. But after bishop to f4, bishop to f4, h3 was played. Of course, the idea is not just to force the knight back, but to avoid the loss of a pawn. But there was actually a better move for black, for white in this position, and that is the move knight to e4. Knight to e4 is a very strong move for white. Taking the pawn here would not really be a good idea because f6 is going to be very strong. So in this position, h3 was played, bishop f4, h3, then knight to e3. What's the point of knight e3? Putting pressure on the rook, and then the queen is about to join in the game, and then the pawn on f5 is hanging. Now remember, the bishop on b2 is still there, not doing much. So pretty much black has two active minor pieces. White has just one, which is the knight on c3. This bishop really has no hope of coming into the game yet because of the pawn structure black has. So after the move knight to e3, which is the tempo on the rook, rook goes to f3, attacking the knight. Queen g5, defending the knight and putting more pressure on g2. So the immediate threat is queen takes g2 mate. So how does white stop that? Rook to g1. And black is back in the game. Now there's a lot of pressure here for this black-white king. Number one, when you have a king that really has no squares to move to, it's a red flag. So if you can check this king, it's going to be a mate. And of course, g3 looks very juicy, a square. If we can get a knight on g3, that's going to be really disastrous for white. So in this position, knight takes g2. Sorry, knight takes f5. After knight takes f5, knight goes to e4, attacking the queen. Queen just simply slides back to g6, defending the knight, defending the pawn. And not a whole lot of things white can do here. Going back to the bishop on b2, remember when that f5 move was made, you pretty much shut your bishop out of the game. So after queen to g6, bishop to a3, putting pressure on the pawn on d6. He played rook f to d. I probably would have played rook a8, but rook f d8. Rook to e1. What's the threat? Not a whole lot of threat actually. Probably just trying to get the knight and the rook back into the game. So knight check. Knight g3 check. Captures. Queen takes d3. Rook takes d3. H takes g3. Very interesting move. Now, if we take stock of this game, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pawns for black. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pawns for white. Looking at this game, normally when you're in an end game, you don't want to have your pawns on the same color with your bishop, especially when your opponent's bishop is the same color with your bishop. But in this situation, it's a little different because the e5 pawn, the d6 pawn, and the possible f5 forms a very strong chain that pretty much holds back the other pieces white has. So it's going to be very difficult for white to try to even save this game. So after the move h takes g3, very good move, making sure the pawn cannot move. And even if there is an exchange of the bishop, either g5 would be a good idea so that if it captures, it can capture back f5. I mean, this is just a very bad position for white. So bishop to c1 was played, of course g5. Bishop takes f4, g takes f4. f5 is coming. There is no way in the world black is going to, white is going to save this game. So king g1. What's the point of king g1? Once you realize you're getting closer and closer to the end game because of the fear pieces on the board, it's important for you to bring your king towards the center of the board. So king to g1 was played, king g7, king to f1, king to g6. Personally, in this position, I would have just played f5. I'll just let that pawn just go. But I like what Mr. Taju played here. When you're in the end game, you have to be very patient because any mistake you make in the end game, you don't have any other phase of the game to get it corrected. So that's actually one of the good traits of an end game player, a good end game player. They're very careful about their choice of moves because they know once the mistake is made, there is no turning back. So king g6 was played, bishop to a3, threatening nothing. B4, very good move. And the idea of b4 is now you cannot play, sorry, a5. You cannot play b4 because of the captures, and then you lose a pawn. Even if you don't lose a pawn, you give black the a file, which is just going to make a lot of white's life really, really difficult. So bishop to a3, threatening nothing. A5, bishop to b2. Finally, black plays f5. I think that move has been begging to be played. So after the move f5, bishop to c3. Now king h5. Personally, in this position, I was going to play a4. What's the point of a4? The idea of a4 is to try to get the rook into the 7th rank. Now b4 definitely will be a bad move because of rook c8 winning the pawn on c4. The pawn on c4 cannot be defended by any of the rooks. Of course, it's on the light square, so bishop on c3 has no business with that pawn on c4. But Mr. Taju move is king to a4. Still a very, we're in the end game, so there's nothing to rush about. Actually, this position, there's really nothing white can do but just to wait to see what black is going to do. So, rook to b1, f5, g4, sorry, bishop to e1, king g3. Well, king h4. So what's the threat? It's pretty much just trying to win a pawn. So it captures on g4, king captures. At least one of the things that has been achieved by the advance of the pawn is the opening up of the h file. So in this position, it would be a good idea for the black rook to switch to the h file because remember, rooks need files to operate. And that's why looking at the white rooks right now, they are really looking bad. Why? Because they have no files to operate on. So b4, ironically, that move actually works against white. But hey, what can white do? Captures on b4, captures back with the rook, captures on a2, rook goes to rook d to b3. I think the reason why this capture doesn't work immediately is because of the rook h8 threatening checkmate, because the rook on the 7 is cutting the king from getting out. So it goes there anyway, threatening checkmate in one move. So rook says, you know what, I don't want you to do that, so I'm just going to move my rook to b2, captures back, bishop d6, bishop e3, protecting the pawn on b6. And also there's a possibility of playing the pawn to e4, followed by f4, followed by f3, 2 pawns here, check here is coming, looking really bad for the white pieces. Oh, white immediately starts to run. Bishop goes back to c5, rook threatening the pawn on g3, F4 defends the pawn. King moves to E to D3, threatening to enter the square um, E4. If the king can get here, it might give black some problems. So of course, black can allow that. You have to bring your king back for there pawn push and just rolling your pawns down. Oh, it says pawn push anyway because you cannot capture the pawn because of the rook check on E8 takes your bishop behind. Good move, Mr. Taju. So king moves, rook all the way, attacking the pawn on G2. He really took his time in this game, and there was absolutely nothing the white pieces can do. Rook to B2, pawn push anyway, captures, captures back, and at this point, white resigns. Interesting game, interesting game. Even though he had its flaws, but you could pretty much tell from the game how the game went, the style of each player. You could tell White is someone that was a little bit of a timid player, and of course Black, was just trying to put his pieces out there. And yeah, so after this game, the score for this round, if I remember, was I think White won this match. Nigeria won this match. The Nigeria won this match against Zimbabwe. It was a 20 up, 1.5. I know I remembered based on the result I saw, I think Oris lost on the first board. Mr. Kaya won on the second board. Mr. Oyeneyin won on the third board, and Mr. Sampson had a draw. Okay, that's it for now. And yes, I'm going to be digging and checking out some of the games some of our older players have played. Just for us to have an idea of what has been done. The games that has been played because we've had so many great players, even though a lot of them are not active. But yes, it's very important for their stories to get told somehow through the games they play. Okay, thank you again, and check out the game, leave comments, and let us know how we can improve on this. Talk to you too soon, and bye for now.